Hello, everyone. My name's Calev Ben-Dor. I'm the deputy editor of the Fathom Journal, and I'm very, very happy and excited to be having a conversation with Matt Levitt. Matt is director of the Reinhard Counter terrorism program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, teaches at Georgetown, and has another long list of impressive things behind him. Now, what we're kind of discussing two things. We're discussing Matt's new book about Hezbollah. And then we're also discussing Israel and Hezbollah's current war, which unfortunately didn't make it in to the second edition. But Matt, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in the first edition of your book, Hezbollah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God, it was published in the UK in 2013. And since then, you write, Hezbollah has continued to carry out terrorist operations around the world, including plots in Thailand 2014, Belgium 2017, Chile 2019, Cyprus 2021, Colombia 2021, Brazil 2023, among others. And its illicit financial activities continue unabated. Actually, before we get to the question, I should just mention to other people that Matt has an incredibly interesting podcast as well that people should look up because it talks about these things. So there's two main trends you discuss in the book. I'd like us to just discuss them one by one. The first trend you describe as Hezbollah's growing role as a regional actor throughout the Middle East, acting in tandem with and at the direction of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Now, Hezbollah operatives were already in Iraq, but you write that it became most obvious when Hezbollah engaged in the Syrian civil war on the side of Assad and the Iranians. And I'll just add here that I think one of the greatest places where there were celebrations when Nasrallah was killed was in the Sunni areas of Syria because of Hezbollah's very active role in the civil war. Then you write, another change came after the January 2020 targeted killing of Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani, and you write that after that, the big change in Hezbollah's behavior has been its new role as a de facto managing partner for Iran's network of militant proxies. And then you add, Hezbollah today helps Iran manage the sometimes contentious relationships between and among Iran's various proxy groups in the region. So, I mean, I don't know if this is a kind of first amongst equals or actually just a qualitatively different type of proxy Hezbollah, but can you describe what this entails and the different things Hezbollah did as part of that role?
So, Calev, again, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And by the way, just for your audience, the name of the Hezbollah podcast is Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule. There's a whole story behind the name, but you have to listen to find that out. Now,
no spoilers here.
you just got to find a way to put
got
that
to
in.
Listen. Fair enough.
So, look, the Hezbollah's role as a regional actor was kind of the really big thing that was what's new in the decade since the second version of the book, the first paperback version of the book came out in 2015. And then also, of course, I discussed the role of Hezbollah in the lead up to October 7th. But its regional role was really, really important. And by the way, it was first discovered by British forces. Just in the past few days, Israelis have reported that one of the senior Hezbollah people who were killed were Ali Musa Dakduk al-Musawi. Dakduk was one of the most senior Hezbollah people in Iraq, a leader of what was called Hezbollah's Unit 3800. He was first arrested by British SAS forces in southern Iraq. He was involved in a very particular attack targeting U.S. forces at a joint U.S.-Iraqi base in Karbala. And he was ultimately, when the coalition left, handed over to the Iraqis. The Iraqis, instead of extraditing him to the United States, where there was a warrant for his arrest, they handed him over to the Iranians, and he then left and started leading Hezbollah activities in the Golan Heights. Hezbollah continues to do things in Iraq, less operational today and more as a money-making machine. Iran is heavily invested in Iraq. It shares a long border. Iranian interests in Iraq run much deeper than elsewhere in the region because for them it's an immediate security concern. Strong memories of the Iran-Iraq War, of course, but that gives Iran's proxies lots of free rein, and Iraq has done Hezbollah has done a lot to try and use Iraq as a place in which they can get access, in particular, to U.S. dollars, which has become increasingly difficult for both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran to get a hold of. The Houthis in Yemen are only able to be as disruptive a factor in the Red Sea, disrupting international shipping and supply chains because of the weapons that Iran has provided and the training that largely Hezbollah has provided. So one of the few remaining senior Hezbollah fighters today, Tabtabai, spent a decent amount of time in southern Lebanon. Then he was sent to Syria as Hezbollah interests in Syria began to pick up pace. But then he was moved from Syria down to Yemen. And not a particularly large deployment, maybe a few dozen people, but an extremely important one. Once Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani is killed by a U.S. airstrike, along with the leader of one of the most important Iraqi militias, Nasrallah and some of his deputies become extremely important players as people with gravitas who can help, navigate the sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating relationships, in particular among the Iraqi Shia militant groups. And so Hezbollah really became much more of a core actor within the Quds Force's efforts to run and manage and coordinate this larger axis of resistance. And now only with 2020 vision, a year after October 7th, can we plug into why that was so important for the Quds Force and for Hezbollah? Because at least 2 years before October 7th, they knew this was coming. And they might not have known that it was coming on October 7th, but they knew it was coming. And coordinating these forces so that you could have a ring of fire around Israel, so you could have a uniting of the fronts by these various groups, why it was so important for someone to immediately step in behind Qasem Soleimani and maintain that coordination.
Okay, I mean that's very, very interesting how that was kind of how not only how they created the ring of fire, but how they created a ring of fire that was actually willing to implement the fire bit. The second trend you discuss in the book is Hezbollah's commitment to resume attacks against Israel, and Nasrallah's increasingly aggressive rhetoric and actions before October the 7th, kind of in the year or two before. So you mention a July 2023 UN Secretary General's report on UNIFIL, that documented Hezbollah actions, and it includes a wide range of things: damaging the security barrier along the blue line, along the border, setting up tents on the Israeli side of the blue line, expanding the illicit presence of armed Hezbollah personnel in the south, in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and conducting, and this was actually very surprising, conducting more than 600 intentional crossings into Israel in violation of the blue line. Nasrallah also threatened to attack Israel's gas fields, and Hezbollah sent someone to carry out an attack inside Israel, which was foiled at Megiddo. It certainly seems like escalatory actions and rhetoric. So, what were Nasrallah's motivations and calculations behind these escalations?
By the way, all those incidents that you mentioned along the blue line, that's not according to Matt Levitt. That's according to UNIFIL's reports to the Secretary General in terms of its observing, monitoring, and reporting requirements that no one pays attention to. But incredible amount of aggressive activity in violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Look, Hezbollah got, let's say, distracted from fighting Israel by virtue of becoming deeply deployed and committed to Syria. Now, when Iran first came to Hassan Nasrallah and said, we think you should get involved in Syria, Nasrallah said, look, I don't think that's a great idea. I think it's going to undermine our position in Lebanon. It's a deeply divided confessional state, could distract us from fighting Israel. A couple of weeks later, instead of sending someone from the Quds Force, they send someone from the office of the supreme leader. And then Nasrallah says, well, why didn't you say so? Right? Because Hezbollah believes in the principle of waliyat al-faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, which means the supreme leader is the mouth of God on planet Earth. And, when he says go, it's not like, well, we'll sort of go. They were all in, not half a foot or 1 foot, but jumped in with 2 feet. As they were able to redeploy out of Syria, they wanted to reestablish what they might call their resistance credentials, right? The Islamic resistance, what I might call their terrorist credentials, targeting Israel. But they had a conundrum because they wanted to do it in such a way that wouldn't elicit a huge Israeli response. There was these new rules of the game, right? So long as Israel didn't carry out an attack in Lebanon, so long as Israel didn't carry out an attack in Lebanon or in Syria or elsewhere that killed a Hezbollah operative, they weren't going to respond, which is why Israel was able to do so much, clearly nowhere near enough, but so much in this kind of what the Israelis called, quote unquote, the war between the wars, targeting Iranian weapon shipments to Hezbollah. So they were looking for these ways to do things that could reassert their resistance credentials, because so many people, even among Hezbollah supporters, said all these people are being killed fighting fellow Muslims, fellow Arabs. In Syria, Hezbollah lost more operatives, more fighters in Syria than in all the wars and conflicts and skirmishes with Israel ever. So it was really important to Hezbollah to kind of say, hey, we are the resistance organization. My favorite case was one you hadn't mentioned, where Iran, in kind of a PR move, decides it's going to send a shipment of oil to Lebanon. Lebanon's experiencing this deep economic crisis. It wasn't enough oil to make any difference, but it was an interesting PR thing. Nasrallah gets up there, and this is the context of Israel and Iran tit-for-tat actions on maritime activity, says, by the way, we consider this ship to be sovereign Lebanese territory. Remember what I just said? Nasrallah's calculus was so long as you didn't kill someone from Hezbollah or do something in Lebanon, they wouldn't respond. Now he's saying this ship has to be considered Lebanon. He's saying to the Israelis, you hit this ship, I will respond, trying to kind of move the goalposts, right? Open the aperture a little bit. And then October 7th happens, and he has this tremendous opportunity. What's so interesting is that he didn't do more than he did because he was concerned about what would happen within Lebanon because of this economic crisis. Nobody in Lebanon but the most hardline people wanted Hezbollah's war of choice that Hezbollah did start on October 8th, but didn't go all the way in. There were only 650 Israeli soldiers across the entire Blue Line border between Israel and Lebanon on October 7th and 8th. Not all of them combat. Had Hezbollah decided to do a cross-border raid, it very well could have been much, much worse than what happened in the south. So Israel, avoided a bullet there, but they were very quietly and very quickly trying to ferry up in helicopters as many soldiers as they could. We saw this year-long, near daily rocket fire into Israel. And it was interesting throughout that what they did, how far they went, and yet in other ways, how far they didn't go. And certainly Hamas was very disappointed.
Okay, so I guess the period between October the 8th, 2023, and now can probably be divided into two. There's the first 11 and a half months, which you touched on just now, which is kind of this attritional thing where 60 to 70 to 80,000 Israeli civilians are evacuated from their homes. Many Lebanese also kind of flee, and there's kind of a back and forth. And then we've kind of got the last month and a half or so. Just a couple of questions. How much military damage do you think Israel's achieved against Hezbollah? And you were talking about Nasrallah, and Nasrallah was really seen as this incredible expert on Israeli society.
The Israel
He,
whisperer.
right. He obviously miscalculated greatly. Why do you think that happened?
Okay, a bunch of great questions. First, it's important to note this is not the first time that he miscalculated greatly. Only it was a much bigger miscalculation this time, because the cost was so much bigger. But the last time was 2006, where Nasrallah later said, "Mea culpa. If I'd known how these Israelis would have responded to me kidnapping some soldiers from within Israeli territory and killing some and kidnapping others, I wouldn't have done it." Since that time, 18 years. Hezbollah built all kinds of capabilities in express violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 war, which boiled down to two basic baskets. Hezbollah was not supposed to be deployed at all south of the Litani River. That obviously was deployed in spades and dug and built all kinds of tunnels and bunkers and moved all kinds of forward deployed weapons. And they weren't supposed to get resupplied, and they got supplied hand over fist, much better, much more weaponry, which gets us to today. Nasrallah, I think, made a critical mistake because he was trying to balance a bunch of interests, but I think this comes down to basic human error. Calev, I sometimes wouldn't notice how much taller one of my kids got because I lived with them as they were growing up, and you just don't see it. But then you see your nephew or your niece who you haven't seen in a while, you're like, oh my God, look how much taller you've gotten. This is the phenomenon that happened with Nasrallah. Because there was a day-to-day, near daily shelling, I don't think he just had his finger on the pulse of Israeli society enough to notice that suddenly, around mid-July, it was too much for Israeli society. It was too much, and therefore for Israeli military and political leaders, it was too much. Primarily, the issue, as you said, of the inability of some 70,000 Israelis displaced from their homes to go home. And as I wrote in July after a visit to Metula, which is farthest northernmost point in the Galil, surrounded by Lebanese territory by 280 degrees, that I wrote at the time, it's ironically perhaps, and maybe contrary to conventional wisdom, the thing that's most likely to lead to war is not the rocket threat that we're also focused on, but the cross-border raid threat. That people are saying that we're not going to go home, even if the rockets stop, if you can't do something to make us truly believe that Hezbollah won't be able to do in the north what Hamas did in the south. And simply saying, hey, we got you is not going to be enough. That's a pre-October 7th mentality. And so here we are. I think Nasrallah miscalculated greatly. The second thing is he really believed in his own propaganda that Israel was as weak as a spider's web. And he saw social divisions and political cleavages. He saw Israel struggling with war for 11 and a half months and the economic impact of that. And he thought time was on his side. And finally, he really thought, frankly, as most of us did, all of us were shocked by what Israel actually was able to carry out. So you can't blame him for being surprised too. He thought there was a mutual deterrence because the fact is, Hezbollah had thousands and thousands of rockets, the ability to rain 1, 2, 3,000 rockets a day on Israel, and by virtue of volume, overwhelm even Israel's four-tier air defense system. And what he didn't know, what we didn't know, what only a small number of Israelis knew is that they actually had done their homework this time, unlike 2006. And they had a plan in waves to be able to take out pagers and take out walkie-talkies and take out people and take out locations and take out leadership and take out fighters and take out rockets and then go in on the ground and take out the cross-border raid capability. It's something that a script Hollywood would reject for being too fanciful. It's a cheap paperback novel, except that it worked. So you said you can break this up into 11 and a half months and then the last month and a half, but Calev, what a month and a half it's been, because the Hezbollah that exists today is a shadow of its former self.
So let's try and detail. So we've got the Radwan units that were along the border. We've got the Hezbollah senior leaders and staff. We've got the precision guided and other missiles, and we've got Hezbollah's position in Lebanon. Over the last 6 weeks or so, how would you evaluate the damage that's been done? Maybe I'm missing one as well. The damage that's been done to those different components of Hezbollah's arsenal and capacity.
So I break this out into three baskets. Okay. The first is the tremendous degradation, really more than degrading, of Hezbollah's rocket capability and its cross-border raid capability, which are ultimately the two big baskets of strategic threats that Hezbollah has posed to Israel. Nothing's ever going to be wiped out completely in this regard, though the vast majority of the cross-border raid capability will be, if it's not already been destroyed, and a huge percentage of the rockets with a focus on the longer range and precision guided rockets and munitions. The recently retired Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said that 80% of the rockets have been taken out. I've heard it's less, maybe 65, 70, whatever it is. It's tremendous. But it's not just that. The command and control, the people who know where the buttons are, the people who know who to give a command to, the people who might receive those commands. are gone or are injured. This is not, as some in the media have described it, decapitation. This is open heart surgery, and you're not putting in a new organ. It's first, second, third, fourth, fifth tier of people. It's taking out one person. Think about Hassan Nasrallah at the top, and then taking out his successor, Hashim Safiuddin. And so now you have Naim Qassem, who's long been the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah, but not really the number two, not in terms of power or importance. And he's the leader of Hezbollah, but really there's a Quds Force guy standing behind him who's actually running things today. This is a severe, severe degradation. If this is all Israel accomplishes, the overwhelming majority of Israelis and many others will say, you know what? Job well done. Suddenly, Hezbollah will not present, at least for a very long time, the level of severe strategic threat that it has had hung over Israel's head for at least the past 18 years. By the way, also a huge blow to Iran, separate from the blow that Israel has done to Iran directly. Iran no longer has the vast majority of these rockets to deter Israel or anybody else from attacking their nuclear program or to use as a second strike capability if someone does. It's not the same threat. The second basket is what happens next along the blue line, along the Lebanese-Israeli border. I think for Israel, this is part of a non-negotiable category of creating a new normal against Iran's new normal. Iran's new normal is the Ring of Fire. It's the uniting the fronts. And Israel is now saying that will not be cost-free. We basically destroyed Hamas's military capability in Gaza. We've done tremendous damage to Hezbollah. We've hit back on the Houthis in Yemen where necessary. The Iraqi Shia militias, I think, have got something coming if Iran responds to Israel again via Iraq. And of course, they've done things directly to Iran as well. As part of this, the Israelis are going to insist that whatever comes next is different than what was. And no one has expectations that there'll be a newer or better UN Security Council resolution with Russia and China on the Security Council. But people talk about a 1701 plus plus, right? As part of that, an understanding that if the Lebanese armed forces, maybe with UNIFIL, with some type of international oversight, if they are not capable or willing to prevent Hezbollah from establishing new bases above ground, new things below ground south of the Litani River, then they just need to understand Israel's post-October 7th new normal is if they need to take care of business, they're going to take care of business. And what the Israelis want from the United States is a side letter saying, look, if we need to do this, it will be understood that this will no longer be considered a violation of 1701. And that won't be easy, and it probably won't be just a snapping of the fingers and done without ever having to fix it or the Israelis. But there will be, I believe, there certainly is the potential for a new normal along that border. No one needs to go in and flush out Hezbollah. That's already been done. They just need the Lebanese armed forces to come in and occupy that space and prevent Hezbollah from coming in and setting up, camps. Not any individual Hezbollah guy from going back to his home in the south. You can't stop that. But organized activity, no. The third basket, which I think is likely to be a bridge too far, and I would love to be wrong, but I fear will be a bridge too far, is for all these years, Lebanese have said, we can't take on Hezbollah. They're too powerful. They're better armed. They're a larger force than the Lebanese armed forces. We need someone to come in and fight them for us. And everybody said, no one's going to come in and fight Hezbollah for you. Well, now the Israelis kind of have. They haven't destroyed Hezbollah, but they've done a lot. And so there's lots of talk by Israelis, by Americans about, could Lebanon assert sovereignty over the whole country? Could they establish a monopoly over the use of force? Could they prevent Hezbollah from continuing to operate as a militia, maybe operate just as a political party? That's a question only Lebanese can answer. But I fear it's going to be a bridge too far because Hezbollah doesn't need rockets and they don't need a cross-border raid capability to turn the remaining many remaining small arms, AK-47s, etc., in the hands of their many thousands of remaining fighters against fellow Lebanese. Anybody who thinks Hezbollah is not going to fight for their position in Lebanon after this, I think has another thing coming. Is it possible to do it? Yes. Will the Lebanese armed forces have the gumption and the support to do it? I don't know. I fear it might be a bridge too far. I would love to see a new tomorrow for Lebanon where it isn't existing with a Hezbollah gun to its head on a day-to-day basis. But that is a decision ultimately that only the Lebanese can make.
Okay, so it's last question, I think. We're talking mid-November. There's going to be a second Trump term, new administration. Been very clear that he kind of wants all of the mess of the Middle East resolved before he comes in. I think Biden's also very keen for some sort of ceasefire. Interestingly, Ron Dermer, one of Netanyahu's kind of closest aides, before he went to America, was actually in Russia, uh, also kind of discussing with them. So I guess it's a two-pronged question. Firstly, might Russia have a constructive role to play in this? Despite kind of the bad actorness in Ukraine and other places. And I don't want you to predict anything, but how likely is it that by January 2025, when Trump comes in, all the different actors will be able to kind of tie these different things together, and there'll be some sort of effective ceasefire?
It's really impossible to say for a variety of reasons. First of all, I do think Russia has some interest in getting a ceasefire so that Hezbollah doesn't get more destroyed. Russia and Hezbollah have been developing a relationship. I wrote about this with a colleague for RUSI, the London-based think tank, some time ago. And they're on the ground in Syria. They have some leverage. Look, Trump is notorious for embracing his role as a disruptor, being unpredictable. There are already signs that the Iranians, that the Palestinians, perhaps even Hezbollah will say, hey, look, maybe it would be possible to make a deal with this guy. He's a deal maker. That's possible. It's possible Trump may not want the certain things done before he comes to office so he can get credit for it. I think it's also the case that he would like a lot of the mess tied up before he comes in. So how he balances that only he can state, and whether there's enough leverage there. I think actors are probably going to be wary of what Trump might do when he comes in, even though I think there's a lot of tension within his MAGA movement. He's been very clear he wants to end wars. He's not looking to get involved in wars, but he's already nominated several people to positions who have been in the new administration who've been very hawkish. How that will play out will be interesting to watch. I think in the near term, though, actors that have not been acting positively across the spectrum, I think are going to be looking at this, wondering if this is a risk they want to take. So I think there is an opportunity now. I think a lot of these actors think that they kind of knew Biden, they kind of knew Harris, figured they'd know how things will go. I can't tell you how things will go. They certainly can't tell you how things will go. And that makes people want to hedge their bets and potentially their losses. So it is possible that some of this gets wrapped up before President-elect Trump reassumes office in January. If not, it's very possible that it happens fairly quickly because people are not going to want to, take that chance. And it's also possible it doesn't. And some people, by design or by default, end up kind of calling his bluff and seeing, well, what's he going to do if he wants to end wars and to force us? I'm not sure that's a calculation I'd recommend people take, because short of full-scale war, there's some pretty big one-offs he can do, like killing Qasem Soleimani. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But I think that the Hezbollahs of the world are going to be a little bit more on their back heel, at least in the moment.
Yeah, I guess the added question, which you can answer or not, is that traditionally since October the 7th, there was linkage Nasrallah had done between the Gaza arena and the Lebanon arena. Now there's, I think, an open question to what extent that linkage exists, but then the question will be, can you clear up Lebanon without finishing in Gaza? And to finish in Gaza also means you need some sort of deal with the hostages, etc., etc. So I think if the arenas are connected, it makes it that a bit more complicated. And if they're separate, then it's probably potentially easier.
But that cuts both ways. Hezbollah backed itself into a corner under Nasrallah, saying they wouldn't stop the shelling of Israel until there was a deal. That gave Yahya Sinwar much more leverage. And while it's true that Prime Minister Netanyahu was kind of playing hardball in those negotiations too, the U.S. officials unanimously say the reason there hasn't been a deal in the South is because Hamas moved the goalposts, and it's all on because of Hamas. Look, Sinwar is gone. That complicates things and maybe also removes the hardest line individual. Hamas is certainly under pressure. Hezbollah is certainly under pressure. So while Hezbollah created the linkage before the Israeli onslaught in Lebanon against Hezbollah, Israel then started saying, you know what? You want linkage? I'll give you linkage. Hezbollah, you're pretty desperate for a ceasefire now. Great. Go talk to your buddies in Tehran, have them talk to their buddies in Hamas, and we'll wrap this all up. So there was kind of this flip. That hasn't happened yet. I could see people still trying to push that line. But short of that, I think people in Israel certainly, and probably even in Hezbollah, would be willing, without saying that they're breaking, to break that link, because Hezbollah clearly has its own interests. Those interests ended up dictating that Hezbollah didn't go all in on October 7th or 8th, or in the 11 and a half months since. They did a lot, but there's a lot more they could have done and didn't. And I think they're going to be looking out for their own interests in this moment too. And frankly, I think they understand that, Hamas can't continue like this forever. It's a terrible thing to have to admit, but, the hostages that are alive won't remain alive forever, which is why Israel has such a focus on trying to get them out. But from Hamas's perspective, they also understand you have leverage with the hostages so long as they're alive. There's a lot less leverage if you're only talking about returning corpses. So please God, there is movement on this in the very near future, and the remaining hostages are freed as quickly as possible. I think there's actually some level of interest in this on all sides now that is going to be given a shot in the arm or a kick in the seat of the pants, depending on how you look at it, by the fact that a disruptor is coming back into office here in the United States, and he wants this done.
You might even say that if Hezbollah changed their mind on the linkage, that would be breaking Hezbollah's non-golden rule.
I would explain to you what that means, but I really want your listeners to
You have to listen.
listen for
Absolutely. So,
themselves. So
Matt,
it's a great.
no, genuinely is. Matt, this was a fantastic tour de force. So thank you very much. The book's excellent. The podcast is excellent. And thank you very much once again for your time.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to Hearst Publishers for publishing the book in the UK, and Fathom for having me on. Calev, this has been a pleasure spending some time talking with you. Please God, the conflicts are resolved, and most importantly, the hostages come home.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. Thank you.